Brian, you may begin.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. On behalf of the U.S. Commercial Service in coordination with the DECs of New Jersey, San Diego, and Connecticut, we welcome all of you to the fourth webinar of a 10-part export compliance series during the month of May, World Trade Month. Today's webinar is titled License. My name is Brian Beams, your host for today's session. The producer of all 10 parts is Tony Sargis. Here's a recap of what we've done. You can see that it is the 9th. We are going to handle license and exceptions and then move on to deemed exports. And then the next week, developing a corporate export management plan is vital for all the listeners. Then move on to site visits. We'll have some really good speakers on just the rest of the series. And then we'll cap the series off with Ask a Compliance Professional. This is when all of our speakers, our subject matter experts, will come together on May 30th. It's your chance again to have a conversation, informal, ask questions, and get the most out of the series. Before I hand it over to our subject matter expert, everyone is currently on listen-only mode. This session is being recorded. If you object, please disconnect at this time. Participants can write in a question into the Q&A feature at any time during this presentation. At the end of June, Tony will send out a summary of recordings, materials, and presentations for all 10 sessions. So be on the lookout for that in the beginning of June. And then lastly, the views and opinions expressed in this presentation may not reflect the official policy or position of the U.S. government. Let's welcome in Jose Abrantes, Senior Manager, Global Trade Compliance with OFS. And Jose is also the Chairman of the District Export Council for Connecticut. Jose?
Thank you, Brian. Hello, everyone. Glad to be here on a topic that can be a little tricky sometimes. Like I said, my name is Jose Abrantes. I'm Senior Manager for Global Trade Compliance for OFS Vitel. We are an optical fiber company, leading solutions in optical fiber, both specialty and telecommunication world. I've been in the compliance world for over 20 years of experience with diverse companies, broad variety of markets. So I've been around for a while. Like I said, I'm also the Connecticut chairman for the Connecticut DEC. So it's been a pleasure. Without further intros, let's talk about what we're here today for, license exceptions. So this can be a little complicated. So in the US, there's really three main licensing agencies. We can go into a little more details with others, but in particular, the Department of Commerce in the US Bureau of Industry, the Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS, and the Department of Commerce, who administers the EAR, Export Administration Regulations. You have the Department of State, and any licensing is managed under the Director Defense Trade Controls, and that deals with ITAR and ITAR licensing. And then you have the Department of Treasury and OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Controls, would also have their own regulations and restrictions. So at any point in time, you need to deal with one of these agencies or two of these agencies for one export transaction. So you really got to understand some of the regulatory restrictions that kind of go around you. So the first, you understand country restrictions, right? So the first thing you look at when you're looking at an order or potential order, where are the countries that are involved in this transaction? Is this country restricted in any way? So for instance, Cuba, North Korea, Iran, those are countries that okay, we're talking about embargoes, but there's also other country restrictions that could limit your product being sold to those countries, right? Talking about Russia, Belarus right now. And then you have end user restrictions. And with end user restrictions, they're different. You can be allowed to do business in a country like China. You're allowed to do business there. But there are several companies that, for one reason or the other, have been listed either sanctioned, denied parties, or restricted. And not just in China, there are companies, there's entities and individuals that are restricted pretty much in every country in the world. So you need to understand if your party, if there's any restrictions related to your customer, who the end user is. This someone that is restricted, and you do that through screening. The third part is understand the product regulatory jurisdiction and restrictions. So what we're talking earlier is my product under the jurisdiction of U.S. Department of Commerce and the BIS, or is my product under Department of Defense and is an ITAR product? Or does my product itself, even in the commerce, or does it have restrictions to the country that I'm shipping it to, right? And then the final one is understanding the nature of your product. And is there any application restrictions? Is this product potentially can be used for a weapon of mass destruction? And if it is, then we need to pay additional scrutiny, additional attention to our product and our supply chain that we wouldn't if our product is not something that would ever be used in the WMD. So you need to understand those 4 steps. And I'm saying that because, now if you understand that, okay, my product is under the jurisdiction of the Department of Commerce and then the BIS, right? So you can define that very clearly. You can self-classify, right? You can say, okay, I know my product is in the commerce, and you can do that, or you can go for it out. So every export out of the U.S. from commerce needs 3 things. One of the 3 things, right? You either need NLR determination, no license required, meaning I have reviewed my product to the country of destination, to the end user destination. I reviewed my product and there is no license required. Or you decide, well, an export license is required. And if an export license is needed, you can have the possibility of looking if there's a license exception. So the first thing is really know your ECCN. A key in determining whether an export license is needed from the Department of Commerce is understanding the ECCN. And ECCN stands for Export Commodity Classification Number. At BIS website, you'll have one of the tools that you'll have this table here and identifies the commerce control list categories, right? And every product could fall under electronics, computers, telecommunications. That's probably where I am a lot of times. Sensors and lasers, where I also spend some time these days, in aerospace and propulsion. So those are the categories that I am in. Then you move on into the product groups, and that could be the item itself, the test, inspection, production equipment under B, C, D, and E. So this defines the first 2 digits of the ECCN. So let's say telecommunication optical fiber would be 5A, and then it has the final codes that are specific. If you need assistance in classifying your product, you can always submit a CCATS through the SNAP-R system, or where you can suggest ECCN. I believe this is the right ECCN, and they'll validate it. You can't just say, oh, here's my product, give me an answer. You actually have to do a little bit of work, put in where you think your product might be. They will validate it. If they didn't like where you're thinking, they will propose you a new one, and that's going to be your new ECCN. If your item falls under the U.S. Department of Commerce, but there's really not identified anywhere in the CCL in the Commerce Control List, it is designated as EAR 99 item. That's just a big bucket that pretty much low technology consumer goods end up. So they don't require license in most situations. Okay. The reason I'm going here is so I'm trying to kind of guide you through the process. So now you have an ECCN. So first thing you've done right first is your product subject to the EAR? Either is a U.S. product made in the U.S. with the U.S. technology, and and it doesn't fall in the CCL. If it does not subject to the EAR, meaning is for instance, a foreign product or is ITAR, you're going to exit the EAR, right? You're out of here. If it is subject to the EAR, you need to identify or classify your product under an ECCN. Find an export commodity classification number on the Commerce Control List. There you're going to say, okay, does it have an ECCN or does not? If it does not, is EAR 99, and you're going to have to follow these certain prohibitions here to determine if a license is required. So is it no NLR or you have a license requirement? Notice that even though it's EAR 99 and the people say, well, there's no controls associated with it, it's very little controls. You may still have a license requirement if you go through one of these general prohibitions 4 to 10 and one of them applies, then a license may be required. So you're not off the hook just because your product is EAR 99. If you have a CCL, do you need to review general prohibitions 4 to 10 if they apply? Yes, you need a license. If no, then you have to go, is there an X in the box under the ECCL for that country? If no, no license required. So you have to put your ECCN and you got to look at the countries and the reasons for control. If there's an X there, then if there's nothing there, then no license required. You're good to go. You can ship. If there's an X, for instance, for that ECCL, for that reason of control for that country, you will be required a license. So when you are required a license, the first thing you got to do is there a license exemption available for you to use? And if there is, then you use the license exception, and you don't have to apply for a license. If that particular ECCN does not have a license exception that you use, then you need to submit a formal license application. So the idea is, even though there are some products that would require a license, there are some license exceptions available out there that you can use.
Jose, do you have to use a license exception if one is available?
You do not have to use a license exception. And I've done that. Sometimes there are requirements, such as reporting requirements, that you would have to follow, and or pre or post. And sometimes you just don't want to have to deal with. Maybe you don't trust that you're going to get all the documentation required. So you just decide, well, I rather have a license and have that. I'm more familiar with that process of a license application, and you can just follow that process. Okay. The license exception is there to ease you some time, to save time, to ease the load on the Department of Commerce. As also has happened where I've applied for a license and the license officer has referred to me back to license exception and say, hey, you can just use this license exception for this particular transaction. Do you want to do it? And that particular side, yeah, that sounds great. So he withdrew my application, and I was able to proceed with the license exception. So you can go both ways. You can go for a license, and a good licensing officer can recommend a license exception, or they not. You can just keep going with a license. But you don't have to use a license exception if you're not comfortable navigating the process, or if you just want that surety, that piece of document from BIS that you authorized. That's what's so nerve-wracking sometimes about license exceptions. Is some of them you make the decisions on your own. So if you're not as comfortable, you may have some hesitancy about moving forward with those. So what are license exceptions? Okay, so they're known by different things. exemptions, exceptions, general licenses for different agencies. So if you hear me call a license exception an exemption, I apologize. That's my ITAR brain plugging in words that shouldn't be there. For the purpose of commerce, we're talking about license exceptions, not exemptions or not general licenses. We'll briefly cover those at the end. So an export license exception is really an authorization that allows you to export or re-export under some stated conditions. Okay, items subject to the EAR that, like we mentioned before, would otherwise require a license. So there are some list-based license exceptions like LVS, GBS, CIV, TSR, ENAP, and these are available only on the extent specified to the extent that they're specified on the Commerce Control List. You cannot move beyond that. They're very clear when you can use those. Then Part 740 of the EAR provides authorization for re-export only to extend each license exemption expressly authorizes, re-export. Some ECCNs, contain license exception STA exclusions paragraphs. So there are things that you gotta go through as you navigate through these. So what are the license exceptions that are available for you under the EAR? So shipments of limited value, license exception LVS is probably one of the most commonly used. Shipments to country group B countries, it's a GBS. So in the EAR, you'll have certain categories like under 740, and then you have country lists and country groups. It will list countries by group A, B, C, D. And so certain groups, like a group B, would be probably friendlier countries. And for some products in the group, if the country is listed in country group B, you would be able to use license exemption GBS. If the country is not there, then you would not, right? Again, there are rules and distinctions that apply to each one of these. Technology and software under restriction, TSR. Some computers under license APP. Temporary imports, exports, re-exports, and transfers in country, TMP. Servicing and replacement of parts and equipment. This is one I've used quite a few times, probably the one I use the most. Governments, international, that's RPL, sorry. Governments, international organizations, international inspections under the Chemical Weapons Convention and the International Space Station, GOV. Gift parcels and humanitarian donations, GFT. Technology and software unrestricted, TSU. Baggage, BAG. Aircraft, vessel, and spacecraft, AVS. Additional permissive re-exports, APR. Encryption, commodity, software, and technology, ENC. Agricultural commodities, AGR. Consumer commodity communication devices, CCD. Strategic Trade Authorization, STA, and support for the Cuban people, SCP, right? I wanted to go over some of these just by reading the title. You kind of know what they are, what they do. So these are the ones that are listed in the EAR. You cannot create your own. You cannot apply an ITAR one on a commerce product. So you'd have to utilize these. Obviously, something like the last one, SCP, is very restrict use for the Cuban people, and you cannot use it for any other humanitarian issues. It's just for the Cuban. And Brian, if there's any questions that kind of come along the way, feel free to put in some. I'm not viewing, I can't see the Q&A.
Yeah, the Q&A.
Okay, so just let me know. So can you use all license exceptions? Okay, and so this is a, you know, the EAR under 740.2, there are restrictions on all license exceptions. So you may not use any license exception if one or more of the following restrictions apply. So under 740.2, I didn't want to go over it. There's a lot there to go through. So before you use any license exception, you need to review 740.2 and you see if any of those restrictions are applicable to your transaction. If they are applicable to your transaction, then you cannot use that license exception, and you'll have to go for a formal license. The other part is a certification. So anytime that you are utilizing a license exception, you are making this statement, right? By using any of the license exceptions, you are certifying that the terms, provisions, and conditions for use of the license exception described in the EAR have been met. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of people would rather, if they're not comfortable navigating in and out of the EAR and this license exceptions, they rather go to the BIS and get a formal license that they can have, rather than have to make this statement. So just here is an example of a category 5 telecommunication device. So this would be where you find in the EAR, you would find the ECCN. So if you see here 5A001, telecommunication systems, equipments, components, and accessories would fall under this one. Right underneath every ECCN, there is a license requirement, reasons for control. So in this particular, items classified under 5A001 are control for national security, anti-terrorism. You'll see here that these, you got to go to the country group, country chart, and if under NS, SL, or AT, if there's an X on the country you're trying to export, there is a license requirement. Under this part here, you would have, so this you will say what the license requirement would be and the reporting requirements. And then underneath every ECCN, you have list-based license exceptions. And it will tell you which licenses you can use. In this case, you could use LVS, GBS, and ACE, and STA. Now you'll see here that even under LVS, even though LVS is allowed, it's not applicable for 5A001.A.B.5 or some of these other ECCNs. So even though LVS can be allowed under 5A001, he excludes. There's an exclusion section here for certain ECCNs. So if your product will fall under this ECCN, would not be applicable. The same thing for GBS. Say yes, meaning yes, license exception GBS is allowed, except for, and enumerates the ECCNs that you cannot use GBS. Same here with ACE, right? Which goes a little bit different, which is yes for 5A001 .I, except for country group E1, E2. So again, this is where you need to pay attention. So I want to show you this for two reasons. First, I want you to be able to see where in the ECCN, where in the EAR, under each ECCN, you'd find which license exceptions are available for your shipment for that product, but also so you would understand that just because it's here, that doesn't mean that you can use it for all, because some of them will list specific exclusions or exceptions out of you being able to utilize this exception. Okay. So I wanted to go over a couple of examples that we could utilize. So license exception LVS, for limited value would authorize the export and re-export in a single shipment of eligible commodities as identified by LVS, which is value limited to certain things. So in this ECC, in the CCL will identify the value that you are permissible. So this license exemption is available for all destinations in country group B. So for that, you need to go into supplement number 1 to part 740. And I apologize, this is a little bit of a there's a lot of technical parts on utilizing exceptions. So my strategy was really try to help you navigate thought process. We won't cover all the license exceptions, and we definitely cannot dive in to each of the different rules that each or restrictions that each license exception can provide. So trying to give you some highlights of where to go find the information and kind of navigate on your own afterwards. So again, LVS available for all destinations on country group B. So if you are exporting it to a country that is in country group C or D, then you are not allowed to ship using license exception LVS. And provided that the net value, of the commodities included in the same order in control under the same ECCN entry on the ECCL does not exceed the amount specified on the LVS paragraph for that entry. There's a lot of rules about understanding what the net value is defined and definitions on what orders are and so forth. So on the LVS, you have, this is the time we're going to go a little more examples, right? You're talking about what do you have? In order to use LVS, you need to have an actual order, okay? There's a net value, and that there's a definition. There's a definition of the net value here. It has to be defined under a single shipment. So for instance, you cannot come up with a scheme. They're saying, oh, okay, this order is worth $10,000, and so I'm going to break it down into multiple shipments of $2,000 each in order so I could utilize license exemption LVS. So that does not work. BIS is smarter than that. So we cannot come up with schemes. So we cannot split it. Has to be a single shipment. Has to be eligible order. Cannot be a potential order. Cannot be something you are shipping to a country and then leave it there. Hopefully someone will buy it in 2 months' time. It has to be an eligible order. The order itself not to exceed the LVS dollar value limit. So it may not be split for you to make that value limit. And has to be, there are restrictions on the annual value that you can ship. So just because you are utilizing a license exception LVS doesn't mean that, oh, my product applies, I can now do whatever I want with it. There's still, read the definitions under the EAR of how to apply this particular one. Sorry, Brian.
Yeah, just say, can the LVS exception apply to technology? Example given documents, etc.
You can, but potentially you'd have to. So there's licenses for technical data that may be more applicable to that. Typically with LVS, I utilize it as an order. There's physical goods. I think license, maybe TSR, may be more applicable to documents or technical data that you may be shipping out. LVS, I would probably use it for more of a unit of a shipment.
Okay, great.
A hardware that you're trying to ship out. But again, go through all the definitions on the eligibility of the order in any of the restrictions for that exception before you utilize it.
And we have one more. If two or more license exemptions qualify, do you select one or should you list all that apply?
You select the one that is most favorable to you. You may have one that has a burden of a requirement, post-shipment requirement. You would have to have an annual report, and the other one does not have an annual report. You probably, if you can use one or the other, you probably use the one that has less of a reportable requirement. There's less of a burden to you, but you would only pick one. You don't need to list both.
Thank you.
So shipments to country group B, the most friendly countries, GBS. The license exception authorizes, again, if the country is listed under country group B in the supplement number 1, except Sudan and Ukraine, of those commodities where the commerce country chart is listed, indicates a license requirement to the ultimate destination for national security reasons only, and identified by GBS, yes. So you got to look at 743.1 of the EAR for reporting requirements for exports of certain commodities under license exception GBS. And Tony, I saw there was like a pop-up that showed up as far as am I covering ITAR exemptions. I have a chart at one of the last slides, but I was not planning on going into great detail for license exemptions for ITAR today. But we have the chart and we'll review them, but we won't go into too much detail on those. So technology and software under restriction. So this is probably a good one for technical data that we were talking earlier, Brian. Permits export and re-export of technology and software where the commerce control chart indicates a license requirement to the ultimate destination for national security reasons only. So if the country is only restricted for NS, then TSR says yes, then you can use license TSR. If there are other license requirements, let's say nuclear proliferation or other reasons of control, then you will not be able to use it. So in this particular one, I want to highlight a written assurance from the consignee before exporting or re-exporting under this license. So you are going to have a license to, instead of getting a license, you are transferring some technology to, let's say, Thailand. But before you do that, you are going to require assurances for the export of this technology or software, written assurances from the consignee that they understand that they are receiving this technology under a license exemption, and there's a burden that they have to comply with U.S. export regulations, and they will not be allowed to retransfer and share this technology information with anyone they want, right? So license exemption TSR is just as good as a license, but there's conditions that they need to follow. So the first one is that you need to have on file a letter of insurance from the consignee, understanding that they are receiving this U.S. technology that is still controlled under U.S. technology after they receive it, and all controls need to be in place for them to do that. So this is one that could be used for the previous example instead of the low value one. Temporary import, exports, re-exports, and transfers in country. License really authorizes various temporary exports and re-exports. We're talking about potentially common uses for tools of the trade. You are going to a country and you need to bring some tools to calibrate the machine. And with that, you also bring kits consisting of replacement parts and components that you commonly used for the repair of that same machine. So you can use this licensed TMP. Exhibition and demonstration. Let's say, for instance, a trade show that you want to be a temporary import or export out. Again, inspection, test, calibration, or repair. Now, if you go through it, any of this, you cannot use a license exception TMP to repair or calibrate a machine if that machine was not exported originally using a proper export license. So you need to understand, okay, I am going to repair this machine that was exported to Vietnam back in 2021 under this license. I'm now going there. I'm going to bring some tools. I'm going to bring some replacement components. I'm going to use license exception TMP. I'm not applying for a license to repair this, but I'm bringing some of this stuff and that's what I'm doing for. So I've got to make sure that what you are repairing was originally under good standing under U.S. export law. In the same line, servicing and replacement of parts and equipment, RPL, authorizes export and re-exports associated with one-for-one replacement of parts, component, accessories, and attachments. Let's say that you had shipped out a mass spectrometer to China. It was there, still under the warranty, or it doesn't matter if it was or not. You had an original license when you export it out. The product's damaged, you are going to bring it in the mass spectrometer back into the US, and you are now sending a replacement unit, or you repaired it and you're sending it out. Rather than get a new export license to ship this mass spectrometer, you can submit a replacement under the license exemption RPL, or the repaired one. There are some rules on that. Make sure that the product has left the country before you send a new one, or you're going to have two mass spectrometers in the country. So there are some rules on how to operate with that. So watch it. But I think this is a valuable license exemption that you can use for products that had been previously exported under a license. Okay. So also authorizes export re-exports of certain items currently subject to the EAR to replace a defense article described in an export or export authorization. So let's say 600 series that would cover some military parts and components. It does not, however, authorize the export or re-export of defense articles under the ITAR. So that's always the case. You cannot utilize a commerce license or exception for ITAR product, and you cannot use an ITAR exemption for a commerce product either. You have to follow one. This is a very useful license exception that you can use for repairs and replacements of machinery and equipment that have been submitted originally under a license. Baggage is probably a common used one. Bag, very creative license exception name there. Oh, this is the wrong one. Sorry, I apologize for that. So this one is not, this part here is incorrect. I'll correct this, Tony, before we send it out. But bag is really authorizes the shipping of personal effects, household effects, vehicles, tools of trade, things that baggage, luggage, right? Or even boxes, containers that you can ship. There are personal items, personal effects that can move from one country to the other. If you are expat, that you are are going to work on a specific country, and you have your personal effects, household effects, a car, tools, you can bring these under license exception bag to cover for that. There was a question earlier about ITAR exemptions. Again, you got to be a little careful with ITAR. Well, any of these before you use any license exemption under the ITAR or exception under commerce. You really got to delve in there and making sure that you understand any restrictions or limitations for that. This is a good cheat sheet for the ITAR. You have license exceptions, exemptions for hardware, for temporary imports. Again, when you are bringing an ITAR item or item that is classified under the munitions list into the US, you are going to need a import license. So when it comes to ITAR, is not only exporting it, but you also need an import license. So temporary imports, you have the ITAR citation there. Export values less than $500. Unclassified models, mock-ups that revealed no control technical data. Again, you are in a trade show, you have a mock-up or a model of a plane, of a jet fighter. You can see the design of it, but there's really no control technical data. You cannot open it and see the guts of it. Most of it will be either gutless or just filled with something that is not relevant. So that is something that you can use for trade shows, potentially. Temporary export to public shows per outstanding DSP 73. So you have to have a DSP 73 that is outstanding. Temporary export of unclassified items to owned or controlled subsidiaries. Okay. Then you have the technical data in defense articles, license exemptions. So I try to group it in categories. Technical data pursuant to official or written requirements, copies of previous authorized technical data to the same recipient, basic operations and maintenance. Again, a variety. I don't necessarily want to read them all. There are country-specific ones: Canada, United Kingdom, and Australia. There are exemptions for Canada. There's a lot of trade between under the ITAR between US and Canada. So these allow for retransfers inside Canada, exports of defense articles and services to Canada, and then temporary imports into the US of Canadian products as well. This facilitates the military complex industry to just go back and forth without having the burden of licensing requirements. Similar, there's a UK exemption and Australia exemption, but not to the same level as the Canada ones. They don't cover as much. Re-exports and retransfers, technology transfers to dual nationals and third nationals, and then U.S. government and foreign military sales, shipments by or for the U.S. government. That would be, for instance, a military base in Saudi Arabia needs some parts and components or some military equipment. You are shipping it to U.S. government overseas. You can ship it under this particular license exemption. You don't need to go in for an ITAR license. And then a distinction between ITAR exemptions and OFAC. So OFAC, we're not talking about exemptions. We're talking about general licenses. So OFAC will issue an executive order imposing sanctions on certain individuals or entities, right? And that has been the case from the beginning of last year. I put the example of Russia and Belarus, right? When they put these executive orders, a lot of times there is a lot of business going on in these countries, and you have a lot of companies or industries that get caught in the middle of it, whether they are now stuck in the middle of a project, whether they have consequences if they cannot finish whatever they're supposed to do, or maybe the sanctions were meant to impact, let's say, telecommunications, but not the use. They wanted only to block certain type of infrastructure, telecommunications, but they still want people in Russia to have internet or to have WhatsApp or something that they can communicate and have word from what's going on in the world. So OFAC then will issue a general license to carve out certain permissible activities that they around a sanction or around the executive order that they had issued previously. So if there is no general license available, then you need to go through and you need to get an OFAC license that covers the activity that you want. But before you do that, you need to review whatever license, general licenses have been created for that. And if you look at some of these Russia-related general license, and if you go to the OFAC website, there will be by certain end users, but also by country. So in this one, this whole category that I copy and paste is Russian harmful foreign activity sanctions, and you'd have the first one authorizing certain activities involving federal, state, budgetary institution, marine rescue service. They can be that specific, right? To allow certain products. The second one, authorization certain servicing transactions involving state corporation bank for development of foreign economic affairs, and they list out. This allows large companies to finish whatever transactions they need to in order to move ahead. And that was it. That was my review of predominantly license exceptions, but also giving you a little review on exemptions under ITAR and general licenses under OFAC. Brian, open now for any